Anyone who has been abreast in infrastructure for the past 6 years has heard of Build, Build, Build. It was a very ambitious economic program. Launched by the previous administration, it was a boon for the economy and it helped bridge our infrastructure deficit. Last year, public infrastructure spending surged to a record high of 1.2 trillion pesos, or about 5.8% of gross domestic product. This is up from 3% at the end of then President Aquino's term. However, amid strong infrastructure spending, the Philippine public debt burden is now at a new high. Is Build 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 sustainable? How will the new administration, led by President Marcos Jr., achieve the objectives of Build 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 without compromising the country's financial health? How should infrastructure stakeholders manage the country's transition to Build 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 2.0? This is Prime Movers, a legal podcast that covers the latest and relevant trends and insights on Philippine legal issues and topics, expertly discussed and diluted down by the experienced legal team at Gorriceta, Africa, Cauton, and Saavedra. Again, this is Prime Movers. In today's podcast, Edsel Tupaz, partner at Gorriceta and lead of the firm's Special Projects Practice Group, will be providing an in-depth discussion on Build 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 2.0 and how both private sector and government can effectively manage infrastructure transitions.
Hi everyone, and welcome to the second episode of Prime Movers. This is Christine Torres, a partner at Gorriceta and a member of the firm's Corporate and Technology Media and Telecommunications groups. Joining me today is Edsel Tupaz, a former senior government executive at the Department of Public Works and Highways. Edsel now leads the Special Projects Practice Group of the firm. He is a recognized expert on right-of-way and site acquisition at DPWH and also served as OIC Director of Legal Services and OIC Undersecretary for Legal Affairs and Priority Projects at DPWH. He was a member of one of the largest bids and awards committees in the Philippine government. Welcome to Prime Movers, Edsel.
Hi, Christine. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm good. Let's get into the brass tacks right away, Edsel. The Marcos Jr. administration has announced that it would continue Build, Build, Build. What was Build, Build, Build all about anyway, and why is it so important?
Build, Build, Build has been the most ambitious infrastructure program in Philippine history. It's a 9 trillion peso infrastructure program, and it's comprised of a number of working parts. First of all, would be what we call a DPWH, or Department of Public Works and Highways, flagship projects and regular projects nationwide. Projects under the Toll Regulatory Board that consists of toll road facilities, PPP expressway projects under the regulatory purview of the TRB, Department of Transportation railway projects, airports, aviation projects, certain ports, flagship projects, even water resources and sewage systems, water and irrigation networks and facilities, power generation projects under the Department of Energy or the DOE, ICT systems, information and communications technology under the DICT, and even at the tail end of the Build term, even projects that were implemented by the Department of Health in the fight against the COVID-19 pandemic. So you could see that Build was really a what we call a whole of government approach to infrastructure. It included everybody, almost everybody from frontline agencies such as the DPWH. I mentioned the DOTR, planning and oversight agencies like the National Economic and Development Authority, Department of Finance, including official development assistance, foreign aid from the likes of Asian Development Bank, World Bank, the government of Japan through the Japan International Cooperation Agency, Korean Exim Bank, and not to mention, Christine, a number of private public-private partnership actors or PPP actors from the private sector. So overall, about 76% of build projects were focused on transportation and mobility. The goal of build is to bridge the infrastructure deficit of the country, sort of accumulated throughout the decades. And to do this, our government planners aimed at a target of infrastructure spending to be about 7% of GDP. So planners thought that, if we consistently spend about 7% of GDP for infrastructure spending, then we may be able to bridge and catch up and overcome the infrastructure deficit, which sort of came about over the past few decades. But there are challenges. So the new Marcos Jr. administration will be inheriting a number of challenges which the Duterte administration also faced. So the real question for us today, Christine, would be how should government and private sector effectively manage the transition between build, and what I call, on the other hand, build 2.0. So how should we transition into and build upon build, so to speak?
Wow, that's a very interesting picture about our country's infrastructure program there, Edsel. But before anything, let me ask you this. Were you part of the build yourself?
That's correct. I in fact led many build flagship projects nationwide, focusing on arterial infrastructure. I was a member of the Build program under the Office of the Secretary at DPWH. As many of you might know, DPWH was the cluster chair of Build, comprising several agencies. It's really an interagency program.
Wow. So, Edsel, what do you think will be the challenges of build, which the new Marcos Jr. administration will be inheriting? And how can the president's new economic team be effective at managing the transition between Duterte's build and build 2.0?
Yeah, as a former insider of the Build program, the main challenge, I think, of the Marcos Jr. administration is for his economic team to manage the rising debt burden while simultaneously bridging the country's infrastructure deficit. I think the second biggest challenge is to address what we call absorptive capacity. That's not a new problem. So, to me, to effectively manage the infrastructure transition, the new administration must focus on these two important things.
Okay, now let's talk about increasing that burden, okay? How is the administration addressing this?
Yeah, certainly. As economists would say, there's no such thing as a free lunch. We've not reached the original target of build, which is to achieve infrastructure spending at 7% of the GDP. In 2021, spending reached only 4.5% of the GDP. Part of that was because of COVID-19. What's more, last year's budget deficit was about 8.6% of the GDP, and the Philippines' debt to GDP ratio was at 63% at the end of the first quarter of this year. Today, I think it's about 62%. So we've surpassed the 60% threshold for developing economies. And as I said, part of it is due to the surge in borrowings to finance the country's pandemic response. But the hope of build was to spur economic growth, increase GDP so that the debt to GDP ratio could stay within manageable levels. So it's thought that higher GDP in a way will offset, the greater infrastructure spending. But in the short term, unless we see a dramatic rise in GDP, our public debt burden will likely be alarming. So the new administration under President Marcos Jr. is approaching the problem by shifting the focus of infrastructure projects back to public-private partnerships, or what we call PPPs, while keeping an eye on, completing pending major flagship projects that were jump-started by the prior administration. So this is a way to preserve the legacy of build without incurring further deterioration in public finances, as it is hoped. So Build 2.0 is really a cross between aggressive implementation of flagship projects that were pipelined in the Duterte administration, but now with a forward-looking focus on PPP projects. So I think Build 2.0 preserves key aspects of the original Build program of the Duterte administration, but BBB 2.0 departs significantly in terms of restoring faith in public-private partnerships, or what we call PPPs.
So if the new administration, will be featuring PPPs as part of their infrastructure program, how should key stakeholders like the government and the private sector alike pursue PPP projects?
A good question, Christine. The Duterte administration did not look at PPPs very favorably, mostly because of the stigma of how slow PPP projects were done during President Aquino's term. I think Duterte was right because public bidding under Republic Act 9184, otherwise known as the Government Procurement Reform Act, had become the main engine for procurement of government projects under Duterte's term. So, and then as it turned out, public bidding was became the more effective, the faster approach in completing, jump starting public works. But being the nature of public bidding, project funding is drawn directly from the government budget, as opposed to, for instance, private sector funding that is inherent in unsolicited proposals under the Build, Operate, Transfer Law, or the BOT law, which is the Republic Act 6957 as amended. Yeah. However, the choice of government procurement or public bidding under RA 9184 came at great cost, because when the pandemic hit, build came to a standstill, and our policy planners had to rechannel public finances towards meeting our pandemic response. So quite understandably, so in 2021, as we increasingly came to terms with COVID-19, our government managed to revamp infrastructure spending, but still at a far cry from achieving the original target of 7% of GDP. Today, the Marcos Jr. administration has decided to revert to PPPs as a mode of financing, similar to what President Aquino did for big ticket projects, while retaining infrastructure spending to be about 5% of GDP.
Wow, great insights there, Edsel. Now, what is our key takeaway then if we are seeing a revival of these PPPs?
Yeah, the key takeaway here is to understand and appreciate our revised, updated framework for PPPs under the current BOT law. So, in particular, incumbents and newcomers alike should focus on the new features of the 2022 revised implementing rules of the BOT law, which were issued earlier this year. Some voices believe that the changes introduced by the 2022 rules are necessary to protect the Filipino people. So it's like a welfare consideration, as a basis to separate, the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, when it comes to selecting private partners. On the other hand, others believe the amendments to the rules are regressive and essentially anti-market. But whatever your opinion on the matter, I mean, this is our infrastructure regime today, and this is something that we just have to work with. Of particular note is the set of rules on contingent liabilities under the revised RRR. The thrust of the rules surrounding contingent liabilities is, quote unquote, to protect the government and the public from excessive payments, undue guarantees, unnecessary fiscal risks, and onerous contractual obligations, close quote. I think, looking at the rules on contingent liabilities under the revised IRR, I think we should focus on the inclusion of MAGA, or what we call material adverse government action clause in contingent liabilities. MAGA refers to any act of the executive branch which the project proponent had no knowledge of or could not reasonably be expected to have knowledge of, prior to the effectivity of the contract, and that occurs after the effectivity of the contract. So tailoring MAGA clauses in PPP contracts will be an important component for successful project management. The rules also state that contingent liabilities shall be set only for risks that the national or local government is best able to control. So some argue here that the new rules on contingent liabilities have the effect of maybe unduly favoring government at the expense of the private sector, which might lead to a decrease of interest among private sector participants to join PPPs. So, but I think in the end, it's important for stakeholders to be able to find a balance between the two sides of the BOT equation, or what we call the two sides of the BOT partnership, in designing PPP projects.
All right. So you mentioned this MAGA, material adverse government action, right? Now, aside from dealing with MAGA, what do you think are the other issues that one should watch out for in PPP projects?
Yeah, there is a perceived lack of speed in PPP projects, and this was quite the stigma that came about in President Aquino's time. And I think the succeeding administration after Aquino, which was the Duterte administration, sort of picked up on that and pounced on it, rightly or wrongly. But just the same, there can be a perception that PPP projects, while creating no public burden, would tend to be slow or might not even be implemented at all. So to address the challenge of speed or lack of speed, I think it'd be well for one to check, the salient portions of the revised rules that involve new requirements for contracts. So one of these is the inclusion of what we call key performance indicators or KPIs, which refer to specific milestones, quantifiable performance measures towards desired outcomes. So these are standards that stakeholders should keep in mind, from the onset, from the draft contract stage all the way to project implementation. I think drafting reasonable KPIs on the government side and adequately understanding and following these KPIs on the private sector side will lead to a more cohesive and effective partnership. I think all parties will also benefit from studying the new guidelines that specify the criteria for approval of projects. And this is of particular focus in section 2.10, 2.10 of the rules. So I think, you know, a a clear understanding of these criteria that pertain to project approval will likely lead to less back and forth, will likely avoid any waste of time and delay between the private and public sector actors, and will likely ensure that everyone's on the same page.
Okay, so aside from PPP projects, in your opinion, Edsel, what is the other distinctive challenge in managing the transition into Build 2.0?
The second challenge, Christine, in managing infrastructure transitions is to address what we call absorptive capacity. So the problems surrounding absorptive capacity are not new. This issue has been there for decades. Low absorptive capacity is characterized by low infrastructure disbursements, which tend to affect, to negatively affect the multiplier effect of our infrastructure spending. Um, the country's biggest infrastructure agencies in the past few years, namely the DPWH and the DOTR, consistently suffer from low disbursement rates. So, for instance, from 2017 to 2020, um, these agencies have average disbursement rates between anywhere between 38% and 43%, respectively. So it's okay. It's getting better, but it's not as rosy as we'd hope to be. To address the problem of absorptive capacity, I think policy reform efforts so far have seemed to be focused on, enhancing, high level legal reform, enhancing such things as the procurement process under RA 9184, large scale legal reform. But I think the best way to address absorptive capacity is not, large scale reform, but really to strengthen grassroots understanding and grassroots competence. So I don't think one must wait for these large scale uh, revisions in legal frameworks and statutes, because much headway I think could be done by really focusing on grassroots competencies, on generating greater private sector participation for typical public bidding. To succeed, one should really underscore a capacity building on the part of government and also capacity building on the part of the private sector. So on the side of government, I think particular emphasis should be made in empowering what we call the Bids and Awards Committee, or the BAC, of various procuring entities. So under RA 9184, members of the BAC have a fixed term of 1 year. So that's under the rules, which is renewable at the discretion of the head of the procuring entity. The key point, Christine, which I wish to make here, is that the more fixed and the more predictable the composition of the BAC, then the greater the stability of the committee and the less interruption in terms of workflows, in terms of you know um, exercising back functions throughout all types of bidding. So I think the appointing authority should really clarify ahead of time any and all discretionary renewals of members, extension of terms, and do what they can to discourage frequent turnovers. Another notable detail is that the composition of the back has a what we call a rank requirement. So the key takeaway here is that having higher ranked officials as part of the BAC would ensure that the committee will have that gravitas, or the power, to shield itself from things like undue influence, from intimidation, from bribery, um, and according to the rules of under RA 9184, the chairperson of the BAC must be at least a third ranking permanent official, while the other members could be around, at least a fifth level or fifth ranking permanent official, or at least an officer of the next lower rank. But I think the key takeaway here is that greater discretion should be allowed among procuring entities, these agencies, for the head of the procuring entity to increase rank requirements, because ranking systems between different entities might not be completely identical, might not be apples to apples, but just the same, it would be good for agencies to really appoint higher level officials as members of the BAC. So on the side of private sector bidders, and again, I'm not trying to sound too self-serving here, but really the most important toolkit for the private sector to me is no other than competent and meticulous legal counsel. So this especially applies for high impact projects with very large ABCs. ABC is another, it's an acronym for approved budget for the contract. So those are large contracts. So it might be too late for legal teams to come in at the bid submission stage. I would really recommend that legal teams be engaged and composed even at the pre-bid conference stage. So that's weeks, months before the actual bid, so that way, your legal team can help you confidently, and in raising questions, clarifications at the pre-bid conference stages, and weeks before the actual bidding, and well before the actual bidding. And in many cases, the entity that is participating in the public bidding will actually listen and maybe even adjust the bid parameters if you have valid observations. So err on the side of caution. So ask for clarification on bid parameters and other bidding requirements. This is not a sign of weakness for private sector participants, but I think it manifests a strong commitment to getting things right in the beginning. These are all pointers, I think, which can lead to effective project management, whether we talk about PPPs or straight public bidding.
That's very informative and insightful, Edsel. Now let's situate the infrastructure program within the COVID-19 pandemic, okay? Aside from PPP bottlenecks and absorptive capacity problems, work from home and other hybrid work arrangements may have brought about new challenges in infrastructure. So, how should the Marcos Jr. administration deal with this hybrid network?
Yeah, this is a great question, Christine, because now we're talking about you and me and our day-to-day experiences. So the key there is soft infrastructure. And the question is how to manage the rise of digital infrastructure as a type of soft infrastructure. And this actually, will implicate one of the firm's core practice areas, which is technology. And I think it would definitely implicate the nexus of technology practice and infrastructure practice. It's a merger between tech and infra. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure many of us have realized how important it is to have a developed digital infrastructure for the country. Digital infrastructure, a robust infrastructure will allow us to participate in digital economies. So you can sort of think of, working at a remote beach somewhere, attending to corporate tasks, meetings, emails, Zoom conferences, with very little interruption, as if you're at the office itself. So that's something that's quite important, especially for the new normal. So digital infrastructure is at the core of how we work. So tech solutions like digital payments, online delivery, digital banking, healthcare, all of these verticals have exploded throughout the pandemic. So in terms of digital infrastructure, I think we should focus on two important aspects. The first is the need to improve broadband services and basically establish more and more cellular towers to address the rising demand for data. The second is we need to bring internet connectivity to the more isolated and underserved areas in the country. So I want to emphasize these two things because, surprisingly, internet penetration here in the Philippines is only about 68% of the total population as of early 2022. Um, Numerically, in terms of cellular towers, the Philippines only has about 23,000 as of 2021, which is way below the ASEAN average, what it's considered to be competitive under ASEAN standards. The ideal ratio is about 100 to 200 households per cell tower, but our actual ratio in our country is about 4,000 households per cell tower. So policymakers say that we need about 50,000 more, to compete with other ASEAN countries. So in the recent State of the Nation address of President Marcos Jr., digital infrastructure became a focal point. The president mentioned the role of DICT to continue, the program of digital connectivity in the country, and also mentioned about the National Broadband Plan and the Common Tower Program. So the Common Tower Program is a program that allows tower inter usage among different telcos. So these programs, by the way, if continued and improved upon, are already big stepping stones for the development of our country's digital infrastructure. Of course, these programs will not be possible without private sector participation, namely the participation of telco companies. So it's important for government to review and check out any regulatory barrier that may come about that would hinder telcos from building infrastructure and from improving online connectivity. So the Duterte administration eased requirements in getting permits for cell towers during the COVID-19 pandemic. That was a good thing. So I would imagine that the new administration will continue something similar. Before companies set up cellular towers, these telcos would need to obtain a franchise before starting operations as what we call a public telecommunications entity, or PTE. So for companies to be able to install, operate, maintain public telecommunications facilities and services, You need to secure what we call a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity, or a CPCN, from the National Telecommunications Commission, or the NTC. Independent tower companies, ITCs, can also own, construct, manage, and operate what we call passive telecommunications tower infrastructure, or PTTIs. But they need to register first with the DICT as an ITC. So you need permits to construct and set up telecommunications and internet infrastructure. So as of today, we have revised Joint Memorandum Circular number 1, what we call JMC number 1, series of 2021. This was issued by several government agencies, DICT, DBWH, NTC, and so on, which provides a fast track process of getting permits for the construction of telecommunications and internet infrastructure. It was provided in Republic Act 11494 that holders of authority granted by the NTC to public telecommunication entities and independent tower companies to require only the building permit for the construction of telecommunications and internet infrastructure. So as of today, this is still good law because it has an effectivity period for about 3 years. But just the same, revised JMC number 1 is probably the more immediate regulation, which I think everyone should dive into.
Yeah, so we discussed the objectives and challenges of Build, Build, Build and how key stakeholders can effectively manage infrastructure transitions into what we dub as Build, Build, Build 2.0. We also talked about how this Build, Build, Build 2.0 is characterized by moderate infrastructure spending coupled with a rising emphasis on PPP projects. We also discussed how soft infrastructure such as digital infrastructure will increasingly be important for the post pandemic world. What is your main takeaway in managing the infrastructure transition into Build, Build, Build 2.0?
My best advice, Christine, would be to strengthen competencies and skills in public procurement. There's no need to wait for major policy shifts to get stuff done. I think all of this, when it comes to skills and competencies, this is well within our control. And I think this goes both for the government side and for the private sector side. So whichever side of the fence you're in, strengthening skills and competencies in managing projects and managing public procurement will really go a long way in managing infrastructure transitions. I still see great hesitation for startups and SMEs in joining public bidding and procurement activities under, let's say, the BOT law. This is probably driven in no small part by a perception that public bidding or the unsolicited proposal process might be rigged or tainted by corruption or whatnot. But I think in most cases, this perception is exaggerated and in many cases without basis at all. Many times, failing at a bid, whether it be an unsolicited proposal for a PPP project or a tender for competitive bidding under RA 9184, would really boil down to fielding, weak teams with holding little appreciation of how public tenders operate. So I think competencies must be strengthened in learning the ropes of public, Philippine bidding documents, the latest versions of Philippine bidding documents, getting to know, the nuances of PhilJEPs, and the implementing rules of both RA 9184 and the BOT law. And it's important for us to gain a good situation sense over public projects more generally. And I think, Christine, this is one of the better scenarios where practice makes perfect.
Wow, thank you so much for your time, Edsel.
Yeah, thanks again as well, Christine, for having me today.
And that is it for our second episode of Prime Movers. We hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from our discussion. In our next episode, we will be talking about energy law and regulations. Make sure to catch it and see you in our next podcast session.